Okay, the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. I say good morning to everyone. I know that you know what we're here for. It's entitled An Overview of the Administration's Federal Research and Development Budget for the Fiscal Year 2013. And in front of you are packets containing written testimony, biography, and truth in testimony disclosures for today's witness, Dr. John P. Holdren. What do we got here? Yeah. I didn't forget the word energy. I just have to recognize myself for 5 minutes opening statement. Dr. Holdren, I certainly want to thank you for appearing with us today. I know it's been a busy week with the late release of the budget just coming out on Monday. As the President's Science Advisor and as Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, you're in a unique position to have a real and tangible influence on the administration's direction in science and technology. So we appreciate you being here to discuss the administration's R&D priorities and to answer our questions. Today's hearing obviously will cover a great deal of ground, so I'll try to be brief with a few points before we hear from you, but we will hear from you shortly. All told, the budget is not much different from your previous budget, so you'll understand that my remarks are not much different than the ones I made last year. Our national debt a year ago was just over $14 trillion. Our debt today is nearly $15.4 trillion, and our national budget deficit has increased by 190% between 2008 and 2012. In his 3 years of office, President Obama has accumulated more debt than ever president from George Washington to Bill Clinton combined. And yet the budget we received earlier this week asked for an additional $3.8 million, or 23.3% of GDP. This level of spending is simply not sustainable, and to be perfectly blunt, it's not creating jobs, growing the economy, or improving the lives of the American taxpayer. I continue to believe that while it's true that prudent investments in science and technology, including STEM education, will almost certainly yield future economic gains and help create new jobs in the future. It's also true that these gains can be hindered by poor decision-making. Hardworking Americans expect and deserve better. With our unemployment still hovering above 8%, they expect us to reduce or eliminate these programs that are duplicative and wasteful and examine ways to advance real job creation and economic growth, not just spend their hard-earned money on what the government assumes is best for them. The budget before us today makes a lot of assumptions about what's best for the American taxpayer. American ingenuity will determine our future. The President said in his recent State of Union address that, I quote, "Innovation demands basic research," and he's right. However, blanket increases, even for our federal science agencies, are not the same as prudent investments and do not guarantee innovation. As stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, we have to curtail runaway spending and prioritize programs that lay the foundation for entrepreneurial success, and we must do that without picking winners and losers. All of the agencies within the committee's jurisdiction, with the exception of NASA, received modest increases in the FY13 request. In better economic times, I could support such increases, but even then, I'd hope that these investments would be prudently made. The increases in this budget are devoted mainly to new, unproven programs or provide significant increases in those areas that are, in my opinion, making assumptions for the American taxpayer. I remain concerned that disproportionate amount of the increase to the FY13 R&D budget, at least as it pertains to a majority of the agencies within the committee's jurisdiction, is directed toward climate change, reducing resources available for higher, larger investments. This continued focus for the federal government's limited research dollars slows our ability to make innovative and perhaps life-alerting advances in other equally, if not more important disciplines. The National Science Foundation, DOE's Office of Science, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration are all funding remarkable research that seeks to improve the way we live our lives, while we should continue to study our changing climate and continue to work toward keeping our air and water clean. We have to closely examine the billions being spent on climate change programs with an eye toward effectiveness. Today, we have already spent $40 billion with absolutely nothing to show for it. We're drowning in red ink, and we need to better prioritize and develop limited R&D dollars to areas that will drive innovation and economic growth. I also want to reiterate my disappointment with the President's budget as it relates to other energy and environmental policy. The budget doubles down on DOE's expensive and troubled green energy programs, while that funding priority basic research at the Office of Science and cutting R&D aimed at advancing traditional domestic energy exploration and production. Meanwhile, the President delivers a wink and a nod to EPA as it continues to regulate affordable energy out of existence, often on the basis of shaky and secretive and faulty science. These efforts contribute to higher energy prices throughout the economy and represent misplaced priority that I hope and expect Congress will reject. And lastly, with regard to NASA, contrary to the favorable treatment received by the bulk of our government's civil R&D endeavors, NASA seems to have been singled out for unequal treatment. No matter that its top-line number is virtually the same as this year's funding. NASA's science enterprise suffers a 3.2% reduction, while the planetary sciences take a grossly disproportionate cut of 20%, bringing to a conclusion for the foreseeable future one of the agency's most exciting and visible science programs. Further, this budget continues to slow-roll development of a new heavy-lift launch vehicle. The NASA Authorization Act of 2010, signed into law by the President, stipulated that the state launch system and the Orion crew capsule be used as a backup capability for supplying and supporting the International Space Station crew and cargo requirements. Instead, NASA is pacing development of these systems to be operational in 2021, which could occur after International Space Station has been retired, after the retirement. America's continued leadership in space and even our national security depend in large part on developing and maintaining this critical capacity. I cannot stress enough the importance of accelerating the launch system to ensure we have an alternative method to transport people and cargo to ISS, as well as the ability to launch missions beyond low Earth orbit. Dr. Holdren, we remain open to working with you as we move forward, but respectfully ask that you take the message back to the President to say that we continue to have significant concerns with his priorities for our national and our nation's very precious and limited research and development dollars is a vast understatement. We thank you and look forward to hearing from you. At this time, I recognize Mrs. Johnson for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my statement, I'd like to welcome a new member to the committee, Suzanne Bonamici, who is from the 1st District of Oregon. The last member that occupied that seat was also a member of this committee, Mr. Wu. And I'll welcome her. Now, if you start me back at 5, because it might take me 10.
I'll give you the gavel if you ask for it.
Well, let me thank you for holding this hearing, and want to welcome Dr. Holdren to the committee as we take our first look at the President's 2013 R&D budget proposals. Investments in research and development and STEM education are critical to fostering innovation and maintaining our nation's competitive edge. But these are also fiscally challenging times. And in looking through the President's R&D and STEM education budget, It is noticeable to me that the agencies are trying hard to be more efficient and achieve the most they can with modest increases, and in many cases having to absorb cuts. Many of these cuts represent difficult choices, and some of us are going to have some disagreements over those choices. But I commend the President for setting priorities and following through with his R&D budget request. It is imperative to our future that we continue to prioritize investments that will advance our knowledge, create new industries and jobs, give our children the grounding in science and technology they will need to succeed in a competitive world economy, and improve the quality of life of all of our citizens. I believe that the President's budget really does that. Having said that, I want to talk a few minutes in which I have some questions. First, I have concerns about some of the funding for the disaster warning, prevention, and mitigation. 2011 was the costliest year ever in terms of economic losses from natural catastrophes. In the United States alone, weather and climate-related disasters in 2011 are estimated to have cost us $55 billion. More than 1,000 people lost their lives in these weather-related events, and an additional 8,000 were injured. The R&D we carry out to ensure that our buildings withstand these disasters and our citizens have the information they need to be safe is necessary to protect both lives and property. As of 2011, show these things really do matter. There's one picture that sticks in my head from the 2008 Hurricane Ike in Galveston, and that's a single white house that was still standing after everything around it was destroyed. The owners of that house talked about how they had built it using the latest design and technologies to make their house resilient. These technologies and engineering designs are based on R&D, much of it supported by our federal agencies. I am pleased that NISC's budget request for 2013 prioritizes this area of research. The modest increase in funding proposed by NIST will help communities recover rapidly from natural disasters with minimum loss of life, damage, and business disruption. But we also need to maintain and continue to improve our prediction capabilities and be able to communicate to local authorities when disasters are looming. I am pleased that NOAA's GOES-R satellite is getting a substantial increase in this budget to keep it on track for 2015 launch. But I have questions about the small cut to the long-troubled JPSS satellite and how that will affect the program's progress and development of the instruments. I also worry that the proposal in the budget to close many of these small regional National Weather Service offices will hamper communications with local authorities and increase the risk of the loss of life. I hope the administration will address these concerns before they start to move on any of these plans. Second, the NASA budget proposes some significant changes and reductions, including to Mars exploration. I have questions about how the proposed cuts to the Mars science program will affect U.S. leadership and critical capability in landing and operating spacecraft on the surface of Mars. I'm also worried about the perception this plan may create that the United States is an unreliable partner in international collaboration and how this might affect the potential for future collaborations. I recognize the fiscal constraints that we are now in, but in some cases, international collaboration is the best way to both maintain U.S. leadership and get the most out of our investments. Finally, let me say a few words about STEM education. In December, Dr. Holdren, you sent us an inventory of federal investments in STEM education. It is the most comprehensive such inventory we have seen, and it has been very helpful, and we thank you for that. Earlier this week, we received a preliminary report on a federal strategic plan for STEM education. I'm also very happy to see good progress on the strategic plan that we asked for in competes. But in the meantime, this budget would propose significant cuts to the STEM education budgets of several of our science agencies. Without the detailed strategic plan to point to, I worry that these cuts lack sufficient justification. Our science agencies contain a wealth of intellectual capital and research infrastructure that can and have inspired, attracted, and educated students and the public in STEM for generations. We need to make some tough choices, and we need to make some wise choices. Let's just make sure we can clearly justify all of those choices. We will have some concerns and disagreements, but let me be clear. This is a good budget for research, innovation, and education under our circumstances. I look forward to working with the President and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the months ahead to come. We need to make sure that the appropriations this Congress will eventually pass properly reflect the need to invest in our future. I want to thank you, Mr. Hall, for holding this hearing, and thank Dr. Holden for being here today. And I yield back.
And we thank you for your good statement. And I want to, on behalf of the Republican side here, welcome Ms. Bonamici, and we know we'll have your assignments worked out to your satisfaction, and look forward to working with you. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements, of course, will be added to the record at this point. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our witness. A good, honorable man, Dr. John Holdren, is President Obama's science advisor, director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Prior to joining the administration, he taught at Harvard and was director of the Woods Hole Research Center. As our witness certainly should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes, but you are the committee today, and we won't put the time on you. We thank you for your very valuable time. We know it takes time from things you need to do. It takes time to be here and to plan your speech for us, and then to give it to us, and then answer questions. That's asking a lot of you. But each of us will have 5 minutes each to ask questions, and ask you to hold your statements to as close to 5 or 10 minutes as you can do so. Dr. Holden, recognize you at this time.
Well, Chairman Hall and Ranking Member Johnson, members of the committee, I thank you for inviting me to testify today on the civilian science and technology components of the President's fiscal year 2013 budget. The President, in his most recent State of the Union address, called on all of us to help create an American economy that's built to last. He called on us to work toward an America that leads the world in educating its people, that attracts a new generation of high-tech manufacturing and high-paying jobs, and that takes control of its own energy. The President's 2013 budget reflects those aims. It includes continuing investment in science and engineering research, as well as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education, the kinds of investments that have long been at the core of America's capacity to innovate, to prosper, and to remain secure. A detailed description of the President's 2013 R&D budget has been provided in my written testimony, and in these brief remarks I will only hit a few highlights. The budget proposes $140.8 billion for federal R&D. That's a 1.4% increase over fiscal year 2012 enacted in current dollars. I'll be using current dollars for all my comparisons here, but you can easily convert to constant dollars if you like, using the projected rate of inflation from 2012 to 2013, which is 1.7%. Within the $140.8 billion total, the budget proposes about $65 billion for non-defense R&D. That's an increase of 5% over the 2012 enacted level. As you know, the R&D total fits within an overall discretionary budget that would be flat at 2011 enacted levels for the second year in a row, consistent with the Budget Control Act agreed to by Congress and the President last August. To get there, we had to make some tough choices. Even aside from defense, which saw decreases in applied research and in development, not all of the science and technology agencies got increases. But those that did included the three agencies that have been identified by this Congress and other distinguished groups as especially important to the nation's continued economic leadership. The National Science Foundation, the primary source of support for academic research in most non-biomedical disciplines, got a 4.8% increase to $7.4 billion. The DOE Office of Science went up 2.4% to $4.6 billion. And the NIST laboratories, which play a huge role in U.S. innovation and industrial competitiveness by supporting research and laboratory facilities in advanced manufacturing and in other critical domains, went up 13.8% to $708 million. The 2013 NASA budget of $17.7 billion, essentially flat with last year, is consistent with the bipartisan agreement between Congress and the administration that balances the agency's several crucial missions. The budget funds continued development of the Heavy Lift Space Launch System and the Orion Multipurpose Crew Vehicle to enable human exploration missions beyond Earth orbit. It also funds the operation and enhanced use of the International Space Station, the development of private sector systems to carry cargo and crew into low Earth orbit, a balanced portfolio of Earth and space science, including a continued commitment to new satellites and programs for Earth observation, a dynamic space technology development program, and a strong aeronautics research effort. It also continues support for a scheduled 2018 launch of the James Webb Space Telescope. The President's budget also proposes to expand, simplify, and make permanent the research and experimentation tax credit in order to spur private investment in R&D, and it maintains momentum to enlist the private sector in our economic renewal through such programs as the Startup America Partnership, a nonprofit alliance of successful business owners, major corporations, and service providers. The budget also addresses the overarching importance of STEM education by investing $3 billion in STEM ed programs across the federal government, a 2.6% increase guided by a soon-to-be-released STEM education strategic plan that shows the way to cutting back on lower priority programs to make room for targeted increases in the programs that work best. In summary, this administration has presented a budget aimed at ensuring that America remains at the center of the global revolution in scientific research and technological innovation. I look forward to working with this committee to make the vision of that budget proposal a reality, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions that the members may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your testimony. And remind all members that the committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes, and at this time I'll open up with the questions and I'll stay with the 5 minutes. We're on close schedule today, and our witnesses' time is valuable, and we're going to try not to delay the meeting if we have a vote. If somebody will take the chair, I'll go vote and come back. We'll work that out as we go. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I'll stay within the 5 minutes. Dr. Holden, where's my deal there? That I handed you. NASA recently announced its intent to use Space Act agreements for the next round of funding for the Commercial Crew Program, and I know you're familiar with that, aren't you? And I know that you're as anxious as anybody, or probably more so than most folks, for the safety standards. But I have a problem with this. Under these agreements, it's my understanding that NASA can't require the companies to meet any safety standards. I don't know how that could have been left out, but how does the agency intend to ensure that these vehicles ultimately are going to be safe enough to take NASA astronauts to the International Space Station alone?
Well, Chairman Hall, it's my understanding that NASA retains the responsibility for ensuring the safety of its astronauts, whether the launches are commercial or government launches. I am not familiar with the level of detail in these particular agreements that you're referring to, but I can't imagine that NASA does not retain that responsibility and that ability. And if there is a problem in the agreements that would jeopardize that, I am sure we will fix it.
We'll look closely at that. NASA, as you know, has to acquire assistance from the companies they deal with, and a close reading of that escapes us if they have that they can require the companies to meet any safety standards, but it's logical that they would, and we may address that to you later, and would thank you for in light of and I thank you for your answer to that, and I understand it. In light of NASA's decision to draw from the joint Mars mission with the European Space Agency in 2016 and 2018, I find your statement a little bit puzzling when you said, quote, "The budget for Mars exploration reflects an integrated strategy that ensures the next steps for the robotic Mars exploration program that support science and long-term human exploration goals." Since we don't have any apparent next mission to Mars, what do you mean by that statement?
Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, I think we retain, notwithstanding deciding that we do not have the budget to go forward with the 2016 and 2018 joint missions with the European Space Agency, we retain the most vigorous and forward-leaning Mars exploration program that there's ever been, the most forward-leaning in the world. We have a surface rover on Mars at the moment. We have the most sophisticated surface rover ever dispatched. The Mars Science Laboratory en route was launched in November, will land in August, size of an SUV. We have 2 satellites in orbit around Mars at this moment, collecting the most extraordinary data, including recently a remarkable set of images showing a landslide on Mars. A capability to observe that has never before existed. We have a 2013 mission, the Mars Atmosphere and Volatile Evolution, or MAVEN mission on the schedule, and additional missions going forward. So I think we are in no way retreating from our commitment to have a vigorous program of Mars exploration, including laying the groundwork for human exploration.
I think we want to certainly keep our work in space, and we want to keep our access to our space station. And we feel endangered there by the lack of any certainty as to when we're going to go back there, but we almost know we're going to do that, and yet keep alive some hope for Mars. But I don't see anything written that's stamped that we're going back to Mars anytime, have any program for it other than a desire to. And we can't spend any money going back to Mars, and people can't spend money to go to the grocery store. So the economy is going to pretty well instruct you and the President and those of us who support those missions. And I hope you agree with that.
Mr. Chairman, the economy obviously has to remain priority one in this budget and going forward. We all understand that, but we also, as the President pointed out in his State of the Union message, cannot afford to neglect the investments in science, technology, innovation, and exploration that are going to be the basis of our future capabilities and our future leadership around the world. We are proposing to spend in this budget $1.88 billion for the heavy lift launch system, one of whose purposes is to enable missions beyond low Earth orbit, including missions to an asteroid, as the President has described, and eventually a mission to Mars. And that is in the budget statements, that Mars remains our eventual destination with these capabilities. There's another $1 billion for the multi-mission crew vehicle, which again has in mind those deep space missions.
I thank you for that, and I know you're available for future questions, even if by mail. I've gone several seconds over my 5 minutes. I now recognize Mrs. Johnson for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holden, you have done quite a bit of work on COMPETES, the mandated STEM inventory, and we are to receive the rest of it soon. Now, in the meantime, the administration's budget for 2013 request includes 20% cuts in STEM education and activities at a number of our agencies, including NASA and NOAA, EPA, and DOE. How do we justify these cuts while the strategic planning process is still underway? I know that we have to be very frugal, but I'm worried about being a penny wise and pound foolish. Can you comment on that a bit?
Yes, I can, Ranking Member Johnson. First of all, as you point out, we did do an extraordinarily thorough inventory of the STEM education programs and what they contain. We will be releasing shortly the full STEM education strategic plan, and the Congress will have that available as it ponders its own conclusions about the budget. But we relied very heavily on the information developed in that inventory and in the preparation of the plan in making our decisions across the STEM ed domain. As I've already indicated, we had really tough choices to make because under the overall constraints of budget discipline that are required, we obviously not only couldn't increase everything, we had to cut some things to make room for increases in others. And what we tried to do is we tried to look for the highest leverage where an additional dollar could make the biggest contribution. Those are tough choices to make, but we believe that the education programs that we propose to scale back have been less effective than the education programs that we propose to scale up. And that was the basis of the decisions. And I hope after you see the STEM education strategic plan that you will agree with us.
Well, thank you. Now, one other question. The satellites for weather and many other things that really does protect and give warning, save lives. Do you think that we have the capability with this budget to maintain our solar satellite program and continue with our forward activity of protecting our public and keeping information readily available for our skies?
Well, first of all, we in the administration completely agree with you that these polar orbiting satellites for weather forecasting and climate monitoring, hurricane tracking, are absolutely crucial. And we have been threatened for some time in a gap that we inherited with the possibility that the existing polar satellites will end their useful lifetime before the replacements are up there. We're doing everything possible to try to be sure that at very least we minimize that gap, even if we don't now have the capability to avoid it altogether. Last year we didn't get as much money appropriated as we asked for those satellites. Neither did we get as much money as we asked for the previous year, and those gaps are hurting us. We are trying to make up for it in this year's budget, and one of the reasons that NOAA's R&D budget has gone down in the President's proposal is precisely to make room for more money for those satellites to minimize that gap, because this is absolutely crucial. And again, it underlines the tough choices we had to make. Nobody wanted to reduce other aspects of the R&D portfolio at NOAA, but we absolutely have to minimize the gap in coverage by those satellites. As you point out, they are crucial, among other things, to minimize the damage from extreme weather events by providing information to people that enable them to make preparations.
Thank you very much. My time is about over.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. We'll now recognize members for their questions. We'll start with Mr. Rohrbacher, the gentleman from California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for being with us today. It's these discussions are always enlightening, although we have some major disagreements. We can do so amicably, and I'll start with one question that's maybe not as such a major disagreement. Notice that the budget request for the DoD's R&D budget request is $11.9 billion, and Secretary Chu says that $770 million of that will go for nuclear energy. Those of us who would think that nuclear energy should be playing a major role would suggest that might be less than what would be as less money than compared to other energy resources that we think are a little more esoteric. But I'd like to talk to you specifically about that nuclear energy request. $60 million is intended for nuclear waste R&D that would go along with the Blue Ribbon Commission report, which we had a hearing on here not too long ago. And, you know, it's been said that waste is only a resource that we're not smart enough to use yet. And I believe that pertains directly to all of this, quote, nuclear waste that we're confronted with. Well, there are several companies that are working right now on transformable fast neutron reactors. Toshiba's 4S reactor, GE's has a thing called the PRISM reactor, and General Atomics has they call it the EM2, and all of these can be used. All of these can use waste as fuel and burn up to 97% more of the material. Well, the Blue Ribbon Commission, of course, sat here and talked to us about how they were supportive of spending billions of dollars to put waste in a hole. I'd like to know, are we going to be spending some of our resources to help develop this new technology rather than putting things in a hole that will help build this technology that can actually burn this waste and put it to good use in providing electricity, safe electricity for the American people?
Well, Congressman Rohrabacher, I always enjoy our friendly interactions. This is a very complicated topic. We could spend the rest of the hearing talking about it, but let me make just a few points.
All right.
One is, I think the Department of Energy's budget for nuclear energy research is commensurate both with the promise and with the fact that nuclear energy is in many respects already a mature industry in the private sector, and you mentioned a number of the companies involved in cutting-edge work there. The private sector does a lot of the work, as it should, in a domain that is this well developed. The second point I'd make is I think all of us, my colleagues and I in OSTP, Secretary Chu in DOE, are very interested in the potential of advanced nuclear energy technologies such as the type you mentioned.
But are you interested in it enough to make sure it's funded as compared to some of these other, as I say, more esoteric?
Well, again, I think the government's funding in this domain is appropriate, given both the promise and given the role of the private sector, which is large. But I would also point out that when you talk about burning nuclear waste, this doesn't actually avoid the problem of ultimately having to put something in the ground. And the reason is that these fast neutron reactors burn the heavy isotopes in the nuclear waste,
right,
which, to be sure, have the longest half-lives. And it is beneficial to burn those and get the energy benefit from them. But one still ends up with a rich array, if you will, of fission products
right,
that do have to be disposed of.
This just makes the problem a lot smaller. And I would suggest that this be something that if we do end up disagreeing on this after some non-hearing discussions, I would suggest that might be something that we will have to push from this side on, because this issue is too important just to talk about putting things in holes, which we could do years ago. And finally, Mr. Chairman, as I've got just a few seconds left, let me be on the record as I'm very concerned about Vice President Biden's statement yesterday that we should speed up the transfer of technology to China, which is I have no idea that the Vice President could say something as stupid as that. But he did, and I'm very interested in finding out whether or not that's the policy of this administration. Thank you very much.
I come to the gentleman's rescue. The gentleman's time has expired, so you don't have to answer that right now, Dr. Holden. Do you insist on an answer?
It would be nice if he could answer that.
Yeah, sure. Can you answer that with a yes or a no?
I will try to be approximately
All right.
that brief. I have not spoken with the Vice President about the particular statement, but certainly there are some technologies that it's in our interest to share with China. We cooperate with China, for example, on influenza. That enables us to get more advanced warning of flu epidemics and to develop vaccines. We share technology with China on nuclear reactor safety, because a nuclear reactor accident in China would be to our detriment as well as theirs. And there are certainly a number of domains in which it's in our national interest to help China address problems that are our problems too.
All right, gentlemen's time has expired. We also gave China our canal down there, a former president did, my recollection. Recognize Mr. Lipinski at this time for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Dr. Holdren for his service and his important role, especially in these tough budget times. I want to first ask about a question about the Weather Service. NOAA provides a severe weather and climate forecast that save lives and property across the country every year. We all know the important job that they do. While I understand the tough choices that had to be made in this time of fiscal constraint, it concerns me that within the NOAA budget request, the National Weather Service line is one of the few line offices receiving a budget decrease. I'm not sure this is the correct priority considering the increase in extreme weather that our country has experienced recently. So in these tight economic times, how does the administration plan to balance the need to invest in promising innovations without sacrificing everyday essentials like the services provided by the National Weather Service?
I would say for some of the details on that question, I would want to consult Administrator Lubchenco. But I would note that, first of all, what is crucial for the National Weather Service to do its job are the basic data coming from observations of what the atmosphere is doing. And if we cannot find the money to support the satellites from which those data come, then all the money in the world poured into the Weather Service won't make up for the deficit. And again, I think part of the challenge in NOAA has been, notwithstanding now a couple of years of appropriations falling short of what we thought was needed for the polar orbiting satellites, we're now trying to make up for that gap. But I also think that we're doing more in promoting symbiosis and synergism among the different components of Earth observation, satellite monitoring, and so on, among NASA, NOAA, the USGS. And if you look at the budget for the Global Change Research Program, which brings together all of those capacities with 13 agencies participating, it is increasingly focused on providing the sort of information that firms and individuals, businesses, farmers need in order to anticipate and respond to extreme weather events and climate change. So we're trying to do more in that domain overall.
I can appreciate the need to put the funding in to get the data. I think we just also need to be careful that we have the people on the ground in the offices on the ground to do what we need with that data. But I wanted to take the rest of my time to move on to another issue, and that's prize competition. As you know, the Competes reauthorization included a prize competition initiative based in part on a Genius Act that I introduced with Representative Frank Wolf. Last year, you told me you were enormously enthusiastic about the potential of prizes, and I was pleased to see the launch of Challenge.gov to highlight and promote this initiative. How has this new authority been used over the past year?
Well, first of all, we remain enormously enthusiastic about prizes, and we've now authorized all of the departments and agencies to use competitions and prizes to achieve their goals, to advance their priorities.
Is there anything new on the horizon that you can talk about?
Well, in fact, we have a full-time person in OSTP who does nothing but work with the agencies on prizes and competitions, and there's a bunch of stuff in the pipeline. I mean, it would take the rest of this hearing to talk about all of the prize and competition activity that's going on, but I think this is one of the richest and most productive domains of getting more for less. And I thank you, Congressman Lipinski, for your role in pushing this forward. It's simply an enormous high leverage opportunity, and we're exploiting it.
I appreciate that, and I like to have the opportunity, since I only got 30 seconds left, won't be able to go into this more, but to discuss more with you where this is going and where the different agencies are taking this. But with that, I will thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Chair at this time recognizes a gentleman from Oak Ridge, Mr. Flashman, Tennessee. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Dr. Holgren. I have a question in regard to the, actually two-part question in regard to fiscal 13. The R&D budget details efforts to strengthen our nation's competitiveness and long-run economic growth. My first question, sir, is what is the administration doing to measure and evaluate the economic impacts of basic research funding? And my second question, sir, is what methods can the federal government use to prioritize funding areas of basic research, both within the area of science and across areas of science?
Congressman Fleischman, those are really tough questions, as you know. We have been working on the STAR metrics program to develop ways to better measure the effectiveness of our investments in research and development. But you mentioned in particular basic research. It's very easy to measure the success of basic research long after the fact, such as the NSF grants to 2 Stanford graduate students named Bryn and Page, who subsequently, on the basis of the research they did, founded Google, which now has $64 billion in annual revenue and employs 20,000 people. So we can look back and say, gee, that was a great investment in basic research. But it is the character of basic research that at the time you're funding it, at the time you're doing it, you have no real idea what the benefits are going to be. And so we have to continue to rely, as we always have, on the competitive peer review process to try to identify the most exciting, interesting, and promising domains of basic research. But we're never going to be able to quantify in advance, rather than retrospectively, what's going to work versus what doesn't. And at the same time, I would say it's not stopping us from trying to get better through the STAR metrics effort at understanding what works best in the way we go about prioritizing research. Your other question has to do with cross-agency, cross-department, cross-topic prioritization. And all I can say there in the brief time available, again, is that we try to think about it in terms of the greatest bang for the buck. Where will an additional dollar do the most good, relatively speaking? But it is fundamentally a very, very difficult task. And as you know, what actually emerges from an interplay between the administration and the Congress that somehow integrates divergent views on where the leverage is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, we recognize Mr. McNerney, gentleman from California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holdren, you mentioned work on public-private partnerships and innovation and entrepreneurship. Would you be able to give an estimate as to how many jobs have been created by these startups, say, over a specific period of time, like a year or so?
The short answer is at this time I would not. I'm reluctant to make particular claims about numbers of jobs. I think those tend to be very squishy. And, you know, I think the data indicate certainly that we're moving in the right direction, but I think it's too soon, although my colleague Alan Kruger, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, might be able to come up with a number at this point. I cannot. I will check with him, and if he's got a number, we'll certainly submit it following the hearing.
And you feel that the current budget proposal has enough resources to continue that progress in the jobs creation?
I think it does, yes.
Thank you. Dr. Holden, one of the greatest technical assets available to the nation is the capability to maintain by our national laboratories. The national laboratories such as Sandia National Laboratories and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California do provide a tremendous amount of expertise in areas that are critical, like cybersecurity, high-performance computing and modeling, biosciences, and so on. Given the technical capabilities at the labs, do you see opportunities for leveraging the federally funded research development centers to provide technical support to the administration and other government agencies?
The short answer is absolutely yes. The national laboratories are enormous sources of discovery, invention, and innovation. Right. We have many programs that are trying to beef up and accelerate the flow of ideas and prospective products from research universities and national laboratories into the private sector and into the marketplace. The energy innovation hubs that the Secretary of Energy initially proposed and have now been funded in considerable measure include linking national laboratories, research universities, and firms to get this translation done. And we need to do more of it.
Are you concerned about the capabilities of these labs, considering possible future budget and funding?
Congressman, I am concerned about the health of all of our R&D ecosystem. And in fact, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which I co-chair, is in the late stages of a study of what we need to do to maintain the quality of that R&D ecosystem across our country, and that includes the national labs, the research universities. It includes the pipeline from schools and community colleges to firms and enterprises. I think we have to be very attentive to the health of this enterprise, and we have to make the investments or the sources of innovation that we're going to need aren't going to be there.
Well, I thank you for that answer, and I share your concern. Dr. Olin, this committee has held several hearings on the safety of hydraulic fracturing. Does the budget, in your opinion, have enough resources devoted to research in this area to help address the growing public concerns about possible contamination of deep water supplies? Your microphone's not working.
I apologize. Congressman, the 2013 budget includes, the proposal of the President includes $45 million for an interagency R&D initiative aimed at exactly those questions. That's a 150% increase over the 2012 enacted level. The research will be coordinated among the Department of Energy, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the EPA. We are convinced that this resource can be exploited safely, but we have to make the investments to be sure that's the way it happens. Because if we don't ensure that it is, in fact, developed safely with appropriate attention to the quality of our water supplies, among other environmental values, then the public is not going to let it happen. And we need that resource, so we need to do it right, and we are determined to do it right.
Thank you for that answer. I yield back.
Chair, at this time recognize Mr. Hultgren, the gentleman from Illinois, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holdren, one of my many constituent physicists recently reminded me that science comes in two forms. I like the way that he put this. He said that two forms of science are Edisonian science, the application of scientific principles to build stuff, and the Einsteinian science, the effort to discover the basic principles themselves. Our system of free enterprise does a very good job at the Edisonian science. Apple, General Electric, Intel, IBM are all examples of that. And since World War II, the United States has been a global leader in the public investment in Einsteinian science as well. But I'm deeply troubled by the President's budget request, as it seems to be quite a pronounced departure from this half-century legacy of American leadership in fundamental research, especially when high-energy physics has made major concessions, particularly closing down the Tevatron. BES received $110 million of the increase, where all other programs in Department of Science receive $8 million, $110 million to $8 million. I wonder, do you think that's an equitable distribution, particularly when Fermilab is cut by 8% in the President's budget request in the midst of an important transition to define a new vital U.S. role in particle physics? If you think this is equitable, I want to know what your plans are for Fermilab.
Congressman Hultgren, the concept of equitable is a difficult one to apply in making tough choices among competing scientific priorities. Again, we have gotten tremendous benefit out of Fermilab. We've gotten tremendous benefit out of the Tevatron. But I think in terms of the Tevatron, there are now other machines in which we participate that are more at the cutting edge and are yielding more cutting-edge results than we can now get from the Tevatron. We could still get some good stuff from the Tevatron, and in better times, we'd have more funding for it. But we made, as I said, some tough choices here. The Fermilab is a national asset. I want to see it maintained. I want to see it healthy. But I would simply reiterate that in this very demanding environment, we tried to make judgments about where the greatest value at the margin was for an additional dollar that could be added one place or another. And since we had to stay flat overall, dollars added one place had to be taken away in another.
First, I would say Fermilab has been incredibly cooperative as far as shutting down the Tevatron and also in Hadron, all the in CERN, all the work that's going on there. I know they've been a great partner over there. But I also absolutely believe this is a devastating departure from what we've done historically, our commitment, again, to discovery. Specifically, I want to get onto LBNE, long-base neutrino experiment. It's been extensively reviewed, including by the National Academy, and has been part of the plans for the field for the last 4 years. The President's budget request severely cuts LBNE and does not even provide the funds to sustain the ongoing operations at Homestake. What are the administration's intentions with regard to LBNE, and how is this momentum-killing approach an effective use of taxpayer funding or helping to drive U.S. scientific leadership? Before you answer that, I do want to remind you of the following, that the PBR support for the design of LBNE has been more than halved from fiscal year 2012, and Homestake Mine is already operating at bare bones efficiency, and again, the PBR cuts it further by 33% to levels insufficient to maintain minimum operations.
Well, Congressman Hultgren, I have to say this is really painful. It's painful for me and painful for my colleagues to have had to engage in making these very tough choices. We are interested in keeping LBNE alive. It is, as you noticed, as you pointed out, just limping along in this budget. I wish we could do better, but to do a lot better, we'd have to take the money from someplace else, and our judgment was that the places we're putting it have, at this point, higher potential on the margin. But I cannot tell you how much I sympathize with the view that important scientific projects in which we have invested in the past and would like to continue to invest in the future simply cannot be afforded under the current fiscal restraints. And we are constantly finding ourselves in this position where our friends in the Congress reiterate the dilemma that we already know we have, is that everybody wants to see the deficit shrunk and the overall budget smaller, and everybody at the same time wants to see the projects and programs with which they're most familiar and they know are valuable continued and expanded. And those views are simply, they can't be completely reconciled.
Well, I do want to continue to work with you on this. I just have to disagree. I think there's some things that we can't afford not to do. This is something that's made America great. By us failing to do basic scientific research, we're failing our young people, we're failing our future. And again, there's huge discrepancy there when $110 million of increase goes to one program and $8 million goes to everything else. Something can be done to even that out, to make sure that we're not absolutely cutting the legs out from programs that are doing good work that really are the promise for our future generations. So I do look forward to working with you. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mrs. Fudge, gentlelady from Ohio, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Holdren, for your testimony today. Certainly, I was pleased to see that the funding request for ARPA-E represents a $75 million increase from fiscal year 2012. For the record, would you please explain the importance of this program and why the administration chose to increase the funding by this amount?
Well, of course, the whole point of ARPA-E is to invest in high-risk, potentially high-return research, potentially transformational research, thinking outside the box. This is what the model, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, did with such huge success. We think ARPA-E has already shown a terrific track record in picking great ideas to support, and it is our strong impression that there are more great ideas to support than have been supported up until now, and so we're trying to ramp the budget up. We didn't actually get as much as we asked for in each of the past years, but we hope the Congress will agree with us this year on this sum, because they're doing a great job over there. And the future of America's energy supply, the future of our capacity to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, our capacity to provide affordable and reliable energy in ways that also respect the environment and reduce the risk from climate change. We've got to be doing this outside the box thinking, and ARPA-E is the place where we're trying to do a lot of it.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree. Second question, Dr. Holdren. During the Science Committee's last hydraulic fracturing hearing, Dr. Goldstein from the University of Pittsburgh and a former assistant administrator of the Office of Research and Development at EPA explained that there are very few public health scientists engaged in research related to hydraulic fracturing and, more generally, the impacts of the current gas drilling boom. How will the initiative take public health impacts into effect, and could it be helpful to include the National Institutes of Health in this new initiative?
Well, certainly the new initiative plans to look at potential health effects, particularly, of course, from water contamination, and how to ensure to minimize those. The Environmental Protection Agency, of course, is very much involved and has that responsibility. They routinely draw on expertise not only within the EPA but outside it, including in the NIH when they need it, and I'm sure they'll be doing so in this case.
Thank you. As you may know, NASA's FY 2013 request for education is $100 million, a $36 million reduction from the appropriation for 2012. How can NASA make progress in improving the effectiveness of its education programs if the agency is constantly reorganizing and restructuring its activities?
You know, we constantly have a big challenge with NASA. It's the same challenge I was describing a moment ago, namely budget caps and too many great and important missions inside that agency to fit within the budget. We all wish, again, that we had more for virtually every program in NASA. But when we did the comparative evaluation that I mentioned before, when we looked at the STEM education programs all across the government, and tried to figure out where the highest gain, highest leverage for additional dollars would be, where we should increase, where we should cut, the NASA program lost a bit in that domain. And that was partly the result of the comparative assessment across the STEM ed programs, and partly the result of the overall pressure in NASA to do everything and to do everything well. Those are tough balancing acts. We did the best we could. I think it makes sense, but I'm sure that you in Congress will be having another look at it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will stay in my 5 minutes. I yield back.
And I thank the lady. Recognize Mr. Cravat, gentleman from Minnesota, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holden, thank you for coming today. Dr. Holden, when I was researching this, I came across something that was a little bit more chilling for me, actually. I'm a member of Homeland Security Committee, and as well as a 24-year Navy veteran and spent 3 years in the South China Sea. My experiences working both these capacities have made me acutely aware of the threats that China poses to our national security. Thus, I am always concerned when I hear about the United States in any capacity collaborating with China on research projects, data sets, technology know-how that could be used as dangerous strategic rival and adversary to our global influence. It is my understanding that your office decided to engage in these sorts of collaborations with China by participating in the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue in May of 2010, despite knowing full well that there was language signed into law by the President Obama prior to your engagement in those U.S.-China dialogues that clearly prohibited NASA and OSTP from using federal funds to develop, design, plan, promulgate, implement, or execute a bilateral policy program, order, or contract of any kind, participate, collaborate, or coordinate in this fashion. It is my further understanding that the GAO investigated this issue and on October 11, 2011, issued an opinion that OSTP violated the law under the Anti-Deficiency Act, which is a fiscal statute that makes it illegal for federal agencies to spend funds that have not been appropriated by Congress. Therefore, Dr. Holdren, I have two questions for you, sir. First, does OSTP plan to continue to participate, collaborate, or coordinate bilaterally with the Chinese this year in the same manner that is found by the GAO to be in violation of the law? A simple yes or no will do, sir.
To that question, a simple yes or no is not practical.
Please explain.
The 2011 appropriations language was deemed by the Office of the Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice in a formal opinion to be inconsistent in part with the constitutional prerogatives of the President to conduct foreign diplomacy. And I was so advised, and I was advised that the opinions of the Department of Justice are binding on officials of the executive branch, including when GAO has a different opinion. The 2012 appropriations language is different. Under the 2012 appropriations language, which now applies, we are allowed, both in OSTP and NASA, to engage in interactions with China, provided that we supply the Congress with 14 days' notice of our intention to do so, and certify that we will not be transferring sensitive information either with respect to security or intellectual property in the course of those interactions. So, of course, in any interactions with China going forward, of which some are planned, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue scheduled for May in Beijing, and surrounding meetings of the Joint Commission on Science and Technology and the U.S.-China Dialogue on Innovation Policy, we have already notified the appropriate members of Congress of our plans to participate and have certified that we will not either be transferring sensitive information or meeting with individuals who have been deemed to be directly involved in human rights violations. So we will be in our future activities within the current law. In terms of our past activities, the binding legal authorities in the executive branch were our guide as to what we should and should not do.
With that said, sir, GAO did find that determining the constitutionality of legislation, providence is in the courts. And also said, in our view, the legislation that was passed by Congress and signed by the President therefore satisfies the Constitution bicameral presentation requirement that is entitled a heavy presumption in favor of the constitutionality of the rule. And with that said, let me go, even with the ranking member saying the emphasis should be for us in the United States to succeed in competitive technology, and yet, notwithstanding the serious legal implications of your continuation to do so, in my opinion, why do you feel it's in the interest of the United States of America to share technology that may have a proliferation of technology that can be used for military purposes and research with a country that directly competes with the United States and intent on stealing information, quite emphasized, on American technologies and innovations? I don't understand that, sir. Could you explain it to me?
Sure. First of all, I do not believe in sharing with China technology or information that could give them an advantage in the security domain or in areas in which we compete with China. Our cooperation with China is strategic. It focuses on domains in which it is in our interest for China to improve its capabilities. It is in our interest to avoid nuclear reactor accidents in China. It is in our interest to avoid the theft of nuclear materials from Chinese facilities. It's in our interest to cooperate with China on influenza so that we get more notice of influenza strains that develop in that part of the world before they get here. It's in our interest to work with China to help them reduce their emissions of pollutants that affect our well-being. Those are the kinds of focuses in which we engage with China in a cooperative way. And I should add that the U.S.-China Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement, under which we operate, was concluded in 1979 and has been observed and expanded by every administration since, Republican as well as Democratic, precisely because it's been recognized on both sides of the aisle that strategically focused cooperation with China is in the national interest of the United States.
I'm out of time for a very long debate, and I will yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his good questions. Ms. Lofgren, we recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Holdren, for being here and for your good work on behalf of our country's future. I wanted to learn more about the proposals in fusion energy and high energy physics generally. We've got the top line reduction, but it's hard to tell what that's going to mean on the ground. And I would just like to note that I think a better process for putting the budget together would be to actually involve the national labs at the very beginning in putting together the proposals rather than having them find out about the same time we do what the top line number is going to be. Lawrence Livermore Lab is not in the district I represent, but it's something that has received, the National Ignition Facility has received bipartisan support for decades. We have spent billions of dollars to get the project to where it is today. And on January 26th, the announcement was made that with a very high degree of confidence, they believe that ignition will be achieved within the next 6 to 18 months. I want to make sure that the budget that we have here doesn't upend decades of work and billions of dollars that have been supported on a bipartisan basis to get where we are today when we're almost to the end of the effort. Can you enlighten us on this?
Well, let me say, first of all, that the national laboratories are involved in the budget process because of their close connections with the Department of Energy. The leadership of the laboratories consult with the leadership in the Department of Energy
if I
preparing
could,
that submission.
Let's go back to that later. Could you get specifically to the NIF?
I can't go specifically to the NIF because I don't have in front of me that level of disaggregation of the budget. I have long and affectionate connections with Livermore, having been on the staff there in the early 70s. I was a consultant to the inertial confinement fusion program for about 20 years thereafter. So I recognize how important it is, how valuable the information from that facility is. But I can't answer your question at this moment about the budget, but I'll be happy to get back to you about it.
Can you answer, I mean, on the top level sheet, we have the point, I got to put my glasses on, the 0.7 and the 1.8 reduction in fusion energy and high energy physics. Do you have any idea what that reduction is going to translate to in terms of?
Well, part of the reduction in fusion is that we are not going to be able to increase the U.S. contribution to the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor at the rate that was programmed in the ITER agreement. Yeah. And we have already spoken with our partner countries about that. So there is some hit on the fusion side, the magnetic fusion side there. But I am simply not in possession off the top of my head of what the numbers are on the National Ignition Facility.
Well, could you do this?
I will get back
Would
to
you get back to me? Because I think
back
on when a former member of Congress, Bill Baker, and some maybe remember him. I mean, this has been a rare bipartisan, effort to make this work, and it would just be a tragedy for the country to step back at the last minute when we're almost there. I'll just shift now to the NASA budget. Given where we are in terms of the overall budget, I guess I'm one who thinks that you've done a reasonably pretty job in trying to put something together that will work, and I want to compliment you for that. In terms of the international effort, I remember being on the committee in the 90s and the arguments we had on the International Space Station, and I will say, in terms of the money and the collaboration, it didn't work out the way it was planned. It became really more of a foreign policy effort for U.S.-Russia relations than it did for anything else. And so I guess, on a global level, when I look at what's happening in the economy in the EU, I have a high degree of skepticism about not just our involvement, but ultimately their involvement. And so I think the proposal being made by the administration is a prudent one, and I think the overall NASA budget is a pretty solid one. I wanted to compliment you for that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the lady for yielding back. Recognize Mr. Smith, a gentleman from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Holdren, thank you for your service. Thank you for your expertise. I'd like to first follow up on a couple of questions that you've already been asked. The chairman, Mr. Hall, asked you a few minutes ago about the administration's commitment to going to Mars. You answered affirmatively. I wonder if that commitment means that you feel that there will be no more delays in the development of the SLS. As you know, there was a 6-month delay last year. Do you foresee us staying on schedule with the development of the SLS?
Congressman Smith, I have a cloudy crystal ball when it comes to predicting whether or not further delays will be encountered, particularly in projects as complicated as rocket science. I did some rocket science early in my career, and I know there are many pitfalls. So I cannot guarantee you that there will not be further hurdles that have to be overcome, but our expectation is to keep SLS on schedule. We want to have that capability. We share that with the Congress.
You are not aware of any plans to delay it? Okay. Thank you. To follow up on another question you were asked about fracking, and no doubt you haven't seen the report yesterday, but yesterday at the meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Vancouver, there was an important report that was released showing that many of the concerns expressed about fracking could be addressed. And I just hope you'll take some time to look at that report, and that might help you get beyond sort of a cautious approach to fracking in the future.
Look, it's also my view that the concerns can be addressed. I would want to make sure that we do address them so that we are able to benefit from that very important resource.
The report was given by a former head of the Geological Survey, so he has some credibility on the subject. Another question is this. The Environmental Protection Agency claims, I think, $12 or $13 billion in savings from their proposed mercury standards on utilities. Members of Congress have not been able to get our hands on the data or analysis that they relied upon after many months of effort. Can you get us that information as well as let us know who paid for the analysis?
I believe I can, and I will certainly look into that as soon as I leave this hearing.
Okay, and when would you be able to get us that information, do you think? Within a week?
Again, my crystal ball is cloudy, but I don't see any reason that we cannot get that information for you, and so I will start working on it immediately.
Thank you, Dr. Holdren. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Recognize Mr. Tonko, the gentleman from New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Holdren, as an energy expert, I believe you would agree with me that the cheapest energy we are ever likely to get is through improvements in efficiency. We have made some progress in that area, but I believe there's much more that we can do. Would you talk about the initiatives in the budget to improve efficiency in production, storage, and use of our energy supplies?
Wow. That is a wonderful question. I was one of those who was saying, actually, in the 1970s, that increasing energy efficiency is the cheapest, safest, fastest, cleanest, surest way to enhance our energy system and our energy prospects. And the renewable and efficiency division in the Department of Energy is proposed for very substantial increases in this budget exactly for that reason. If you look at the focuses of the energy hubs, which are one of the centerpieces of Secretary Chu's innovation strategy in energy, there's a hub on improving battery and energy storage technology. There's a hub on building energy efficiency. And the sixth hub, which is now being proposed, is a hub focusing on the grid and the efficiencies that can be derived there. So we have a big emphasis on increasing efficiency precisely because of the leverage that you point to in that domain. It passes our test of where additional dollars do the most good.
Thank you. The President has also focused on strengthening our manufacturing sector. And by strengthening it, I believe we need to address, again, the sort of innovation and efficiency that's possible within manufacturing. There are those who believe in that investment. Others would suggest that we're picking winners and losers, and it becomes interventionist in design and unacceptable. Can you address areas where government sponsorship, in your opinion, of research could fill gaps that the private sector alone cannot?
Well, Congressman, I'd answer that in two ways. First of all, we know that the private sector tends to underinvest in basic research for the very simple reason that the results are unpredictable, the rate of return cannot realistically be estimated, and many of the benefits are not appropriable by the investor. That is, the results of basic research propagate in ways that many different people benefit rather than just the folks who paid the bills. For that reason, it has always been the case that the government has had to be a leader in investment in basic research, and yet the flow of discovery that comes from basic research feeds the innovation that produces the next generation of products, process improvements, new techniques for manufacturing that ultimately benefit the economy. Second thing I would say is, as opposed to picking winners, what the government is doing in the way of encouraging innovation beyond its strong investments in basic research, which is its historic responsibility in this domain, are cross-cutting, systematic ways to encourage innovation in the private sector. So, again, we talk about simplifying and making permanent the research and experimentation tax credit. We talk about unlocking access to capital, including a $2 billion fund being proposed to match private funds investing in underserved markets and early-stage companies. In the Startup America initiative, we have a program for connecting mentors to entrepreneurs. So we take successful entrepreneurs who mentor emerging ones on what it takes to succeed, to improve the success rate in entrepreneurship. We have been building up a variety of ways, as I mentioned before, to connect our research universities and their laboratories and the national laboratories to the private sector in a manner that will accelerate the flow of discovery into practical innovations in the private sector without respect to picking particular products or potential products or particular processes, but strengthening the innovation ecosystem that produces these flows.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Biggert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here, Dr. Holgren. In your testimony, you referred to the DOE Office of Science as a jewel in the crown agency that is especially important to this nation's continued economic leadership. And you also note that the President remains committed to doubling the budget of key basic research programs at the Office of Science, along with NIST and NSF. However, the budget request for the Office of Science is proposed to increase by only 2.4%. At that rate, it would take about 30 years to double the budget, and that doesn't even account for inflation and what would occur during that time. And meanwhile, we've got some unproven, maybe green energy programs within DOE, such as EERE and ARPA-E, proposed to increase by 29% and 27% respectively. Why is the funding for the Office of Science such a low priority relative to other DOE programs?
Well, first of all, we are committed, we remain committed to keeping the NSF, the DOE Office of Science, and the NIST laboratories on a rising trajectory. Clearly, the budget constraints under which we now operate have made the goal of doubling more difficult, and unfortunately your arithmetic is correct. At that growth rate in the Office of Science, it would take a long time for it to double. And we have made tough choices across NSF, DOE Office of Science, NIST laboratories, trying to look for the most promising opportunities to increase things. When you mention the unproven technologies in DOE that are getting attention, of course it's precisely the unproven technologies that require government attention. The proven technologies will be pursued successfully by the private sector. And we think there is a large societal interest in getting some of these unproven technologies into the proven category, because they will bring big benefits in reduced oil dependence, reduced import dependence, improved environmental characteristics, and so on.
What does worry me is that we've had the green energy, what we could call boondoggles, I guess, such as Solyndra, and that might signal that the DOE should make the well-managed, world-class basic research at DOE a higher priority. But my next question is about a different subject, and that's our nation's communication system is repeatedly threatened by cyber attacks, making the protection of critical infrastructure a national priority. How does the administration propose to use our supercomputing resources to spur new research that keeps us ahead of ever innovating attackers?
I'd love to be able to answer that question, but of course a lot of what we're doing in that domain is understandably classified. But you can be sure that cybersecurity is a very high priority for this administration. We understand the threat. We have a cybersecurity strategy. We are employing all manner of scientific and technical resources to try to stay on top of this threat, which is real and is large.
Can you say anything about how the research can be connected to industries and agencies that need to protect their systems?
Absolutely, I can. Within the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which is set up to provide the administration reach into the private sector, the academic sector, the philanthropic sector, we have the former CEO of Google, the chief technology officer of Microsoft, and so on and so forth, as members of PCAST. We have a PCAST working group on cybersecurity that is focused on exactly this question. But we also have within the government a variety of committees. The National Science and Technology Advisory Committee, NSTAC, which is composed of the leaders of the information industry who come together in Washington and advise the administration, Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Agency, Central Intelligence, the White House, on how we can coordinate our efforts in cybersecurity. So this is a big focus.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much as well. And Dr. Holdren, thank you so much for being here with us. We appreciate the commitment to research and development and innovation as keys to America's economic success. And Mr. Holdren, I want to jump right into the area there. I appreciate the questions that have come from our colleagues, the attention to the national labs from both sides of the aisle with Ms. Biggert, Ms. Lofgren, as well as Mr. McNerney, and the explanation to Mr. Tonko with the innovation ecosystem. I think inherently therein lies the answers to many of America's economic woes when we talk about innovation as well as economic strength are America's national labs. Coming from a state that has both Sandia and Los Alamos National Laboratory, we understand the importance of that science and the research that takes place there. We would ask Mr. Holdren or Dr. Holdren that now that you and have had the ear of the President and with Dr. Chu, that when we're talking about the entrepreneurial leave programs that many of our scientists, physicists, engineers, mathematicians, and experts at our national labs can engage in, as well as addressing the conflict of interest inherently associated with making them more available to small businesses, entrepreneurs out there, that we address that and look closely at that to see what can be done. Because there is good work that's being done, and it looks good on paper, but all indications is there is dramatic room for improvement. And I really believe that once we unleash the power inherently therein from our national labs, we can solve those economic problems and not just stop there. There's promise across the country with physicists, scientists, and engineers at many of our national labs working with teachers and students and improving our educational system across America. And just in the way that we would talk about an entrepreneurial leave program, I think we can talk about an educational leave program associated with many of those bright minds that we have within our national labs to help solve those problems. And I would suggest that it's part of our national security to be able to address many of these issues. Specifically, Dr. Holdren, a few months ago, the President issued an executive memorandum urging the federal agency heads to step up their technology transfer activities. Could you please address the progress being made in this area, and if any of this is reflected in the 2013 budget? And also, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, a technology commercialization fund was created within the Department of Energy to promote promising energy technologies for commercial purposes, and I'd like for you to share a little bit about that as well.
Okay, big questions for a short time period. But I mean, let me say first of all, I agree with everything you said about the importance of the national labs and the fact that there is more we could still do to facilitate making those intellectual resources more widely available. The President's Educate to Innovate program, which he announced originally in November of 2009, has as one of its major features bringing practicing scientists, engineers, and mathematicians from national labs, research universities, and firms into classrooms, middle school, high school classrooms, to work with science and math teachers to provide more hands-on activities and experiences that get kids excited about science and engineering and to serve as role models. I've already mentioned the innovation hubs that, again, are aimed at making sure the expertise in the national laboratories get applied in the private sector and in the marketplace. You mentioned the executive order on accelerating technology transfer activities and asked for a progress report. As far as I know, it's too soon to have any quantitative measures of how well that's working, but I will try to get back to you on it, see if we have anything on that already. But my guess is it's a little soon to judge the degree of success these programs are having. But I can certainly assure you that both in my office and in the West Wing of the White House, there's a tremendous amount of interest in getting this right. The Jobs Council, which has met regularly with the President, is focused on this. OSTP is focused on it. I think the room for improvement is going to be exploited, and we are going to improve.
Thank you with that, Dr. Holdren. And the only thing I would add, in addition to thanking you and the team that's with you today, as well as those that are probably tuning in, is as we talk about the contracts with the national labs, as those are coming up, that to the extent possible that we tie job creation as well as the technology commercialization, maturation, and transfer aspects associated inherently with those contracts, so that way we can encourage that behavior as much as we possibly can. And I appreciate your attention to this in support of the national labs as well, sir. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And I thank you for yielding. Now the very patient Mr. Sarbanes is recognized for a quick 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Thank you for your testimony today. There's a program under NIST called the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which I know you're familiar with, and it's a resource to manufacturers across the country to help sort of boost their opportunities and organize those opportunities, et cetera. And there's an initiative within the MEP program called the Supplier Scouting Program, which is I don't think it occupies a major line item in the budget, but it's a recent initiative that attempts to match small and medium-sized American manufacturers with these various supply chain needs that arise as a result of major infrastructure projects across the country. So it's a terrific idea and innovation, because what it's doing is it's really helping make that connection so that when you have a major infrastructure project, you can get bidders and vendors coming forward who are American manufacturers, and they can get into that supply chain. And I really just wanted to commend NIST for this and the innovation that the MEP program has managed to put forward here with the supplier scouting program. There's been a lot of progress with this, with the Department of Transportation has taken a lot of initiative, the Department of Energy, the Defense Department, and I think it's a terrific model going forward for how you make these connections, and just hope that, you know, the President will continue and you'll continue to support that kind of initiative, particularly now as we're recognizing the real opportunities to boost American manufacturing going forward. This is something that we can take full advantage of, and I just hope that that'll continue to be a point of emphasis with you.
Well, it is going to be a continuing point of emphasis. Gives me an opportunity to say that NIST is an amazingly agile and effective organization. Its head, Dr. Pat Gallagher, is one of my closest colleagues and collaborators in this domain of innovation and figuring out how to lift our game in promoting manufacturing and particularly high-tech advanced manufacturing in this country. The Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, which has been headed by Andrew Leveris of Dow and Susan Hockfield, the president of MIT, has been part of that, linking industry, academia, and the government in some of these initiatives. And so I thank you for that comment. This is a high priority for us, and we're going to keep pursuing it.
Thank you. Let me ask you another question. There's something called the National Science and Technology Council Committee on STEM Education, which recently, as you know, submitted its first annual report and apparently identified about 252 federally funded STEM activities across the government that are currently underway, and noted that in many instances they have different objectives. They're focused on different products. They have different target audiences, et cetera, and recommended that there be a more efficient approach to this, looking for better coherence among these multiple programs. And I wanted to get your comment on that. I think you were involved in some of those findings, and I'm also curious as to whether you think the efficiency we'd like to see there in terms of the way these programs work together and these initiatives work together is something we can rely on the agencies to undertake themselves, or whether they could use a push from the President and his office to make that happen.
Well, thank you. Yes, the National Science and Technology Council is a body that was created in order to make sure that all science and technology-related activities that cross departmental and agency boundaries are appropriately coordinated. And I chair it on behalf of the President, and all the agencies that have science and technology and STEM education missions are represented there. And so it has 5 standing committees under the Council, and one of those is the STEM Education Committee that's chaired by Dr. Carl Wyman, the Physics Nobel Prize winner, who is my Associate Director for Science in OSTP. And as you point out, they did do a survey which established that there are well over 200 programs in STEM education spread across the agencies. But the idea was not that these all need to be consolidated. The idea was to determine to what extent there is overlap and duplication in their activities and their missions, and to try to determine which ones are more effective and which ones are less effective. But we recognize, and the NST STEM Education Committee recognizes, that a lot of the diversity in those programs is fully warranted. These agencies and their programs have different focuses, different missions, different constituencies, different sets of kids and different levels of education on which they're focused. And our intention in following up those recommendations, and I mentioned there is going to be a strategic plan forthcoming shortly, is not to pretend that one size fits all in STEM education and scrunch these things all together, but rather to coordinate and orchestrate the appropriate diversity of these programs in a way so that to the extent that there is duplication and to the extent that there are important missions that are left out altogether, we fix that.
Appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. And Dr. Holden, I thank you, and we all thank you for your very valuable testimony, for the time you've given us, and I thank the members for their questions. Might ask that the members of the committee have additional questions to you, Dr. Holden, as they'll submit to you. Ask that you respond to them in writing when you can, as soon as you can. The record will remain open for at least 2 weeks for additional comments from members. And with that, Dr. Holden, you are excused and the hearing is adjourned.